Okay, so as many of you might know, we launched our inaugural CRS Symposium last year. Would not have been possible to start, to initiate this signature event of our program without the support of the law school administration, and in particular Dean Schill, who's been just absolutely fantastic in working with us and the faculty about in forming a signature event. And so we are glad that he can join us today again to welcome and introduce our keynote speaker.
Thank you, Saul. You were talking earlier about Saul, his job in part is to herd the cats and get this thing, on schedule. So as I was walking down from upstairs, I said, well, can I say all sorts of wonderful things about the program and all that sort of thing? And he said, no. He said, you gotta be quick. We have to stay on schedule. So I want to incorporate by reference some of what I'll say probably at the reception. And I won't make you listen to it twice about how wonderful this program is, but this program is a jewel in our crown, and it is the only program that at 5:30 on a Friday could ever get this many people to stay at the law school. And I'm always. Now, I know part of that was waiting to hear me, welcome you, but really there's an extraordinary amount of energy in the program and in you all who are here, and I'm just delighted that you're all here today and being part of this. And what I will do right now is really just introduce our keynote speaker, Dr. Dwight Mcbride, who is an alumnus of UCLA. Dr. Mcbride graduated from UCLA with both an MA and a PhD in English. Somehow you managed to avoid the law school, or maybe you avoided the law school. You might have taken a class here, but you certainly don't have a degree from here. And you're now serving as Dean of the College of Liberal Arts and Sciences at the University of Illinois at Chicago. Where you're also Professor of African American Studies, English, and Gender and Women's Studies. Dr. Mcbride has a very long resume and a very long introduction, of which I'm not going to I'm not going to go through it all, but his work, as many of you know, is in the area of race and literary studies. It examines the connection between race theory, black studies, and identity politics. And he has two recent publications. The first is a co-edited volume called A Melvin Dixon Critical Reader, which is a collection of critical essays on the literature and life from the African American activist and scholar. And then I wanted to include this one because it's got a great title, Why I Hate Abercrombie and Fitch, Essays on Race and Sexuality, which is a collection of his personal essays offering contemporary cultural criticism. And that volume was nominated for the 2006 Lambda Literary Award and the 2006 Hurston Wright Legacy Award. And I'm just absolutely delighted to have you here today and holding force and holding all the people in the room. And I'll look forward to seeing you all at the reception. I'll be sitting in the back now, but welcome.
Thank you so much. Is it okay if I sit here? Is that okay? Good, because it's been a long day, a really good day, but mine started yesterday really with the trip out after a long day at the office, and I got into my hotel room about 1:30 last night, so I'm still a little, wouldn't call it jet lagged from Chicago, but a little something, not quite me, so maybe sitting will help a little bit today. I want to begin by first of all thanking Russell and thanking Devin and thanking Jerry, who I met today, and thanking Saul and your colleagues in the Critical Race Studies program here for just an absolutely stupendous day. The one thing about being in the Dean's office is I don't get to do this so often anymore. That is, actually go to conferences and listen to papers and hear good, new, interesting, exciting work. And today has just been fantastic. And I am also glad to be back at UCLA. This is the first time I think that I've actually spoken on this campus since I was here in 1997 last. And it's great to see a lot of familiar faces here today. It was great to see Horacio here on the last panel. We were in school here together. Saul, my friend Bob, who's sitting in the back, the smartest person I met in graduate school, and Rita Rothman, who's here as well, who is just a wonderful and generous supporter of this institution, and also a great old friend of mine, and of course, Kimberle Crenshaw. Is she still in the room? Just so that Kimberle knows, I'll tell it when she gets back, actually. I'll wait, because I want to make sure she hears that. And Cheryl as well, who she may not remember this, but her first year at UCLA, I was one of those fawning graduate students in a seminar that a presentation that she gave on whiteness as property back in the day. So it was really a lot of great memory around this place that really has been flooding back for me today too, and it's just great to see so many people doing such incredible things and such incredible work. So thank you for having me here. I'll start because I know time is limited, and I'm going to try and read briskly. The monitor down here is telling me how much time I have. The title of the presentation today is called Race, Faith, and Sexuality, or A Snapshot Genealogy of the Grateful Negro. I wrote this piece, originally it started as a part of another book project that I'm working on that had a working title of Race, Sexuality, and the Law, oddly enough. And I think I'm going to change it now. But it's actually first going to appear in a special issue of a journal that should be coming out in the fall. And the special issue is on foreignness and notions of the foreigner. So with that, I begin with the epigraph from the King James Bible, Mark 6:4. A prophet is not without honor, but in his own country and among his own kin and in his own house. When asked to reflect on the notion of the foreigner and the idea of foreignness in my own work, the task appeared at once stimulating and overwhelming. Stimulating because my mind did not first turn to the predictable geopolitical notions of the citizen versus the foreigner, which seem so pervasive in the U.S. Politics at the present time, but rather to concerns with what notions of foreignness must be operable for the very idea of community to be in effect. Overwhelming because once we embark down that road, we must also confront, as Bonnie Honig suggests in Democracy and the Foreigner, the degree to which the figure of the foreigner is constitutive to our very notion of democracy. Toni Morrison once pointed out in a discussion of a program that she was invited to host at the Louvre in Paris, titled The Foreigner's Home, how curious she found it that there is no word for home in the French language. Domicile, or house, yes, but not home in the sense that we mean when we say you can never go home again. Home as place, yes, but never home as the complex web of memory and emotion. On a related note, there's a phrase in French that is extremely evocative on this idea of foreignness, and Bob will remember this, étrange, étranger, or the strange stranger. I've always been captivated by the nuance of this phrasing, as it seems to allow for the simultaneous possibility of strangers or foreigners who are indeed strange or unknown to us, as well as those who might be all too familiar. The phrase leaves room for the fact that the familiar can also be strange and foreign in the way that the Negro, Black, African American has always been in the history of the U.S. and in much of the West. This is what Richard Wright meant when he declared that the Negro is America's metaphor, and what another writer intended when he said, if the African Negro did not exist, then white men would have had to invent him. Much of my recent work has attempted to look closely at the nexus of race and sexuality in U.S. culture and political rhetoric. I've been particularly interested in representations, or the lack thereof, of black gays and lesbians, or black gay and lesbian sexuality in the context of black anti-racist discourses. To my mind, the metaphor of the Negro represents an apt way of characterizing the historic and present relationship of black queers to the hegemonic concept or construct of the black community. Put simply, black queers have been a staple organizing principle against which black anti-racist discourse works to legitimate black lives under the regime of white supremacy. That is to say that black queers are the black community's Negro. Still, even as dominant conceptions of the black community have tried to erase black queers and black queer identity, it has needed and celebrated the work and cultural production of black queers. A colleague of mine once remarked that were we to extract all of the gay and lesbian writers from the black literary canon, there would be no Harlem Renaissance. Now, though a bit hyperbolic, he was not far off the mark in his commentary. It is this complex tension between the desire of the black community to exclude black queers and to differentiate themselves from the same, and its desire to claim the incredible work and cultural products of black queers that first drew me to the epigraph that opens the paper. A prophet is not without honor, but in his own country and among his own kin and his own house. Now, while I am no prophet, as a black gay man, I not only bear witness to the subtle and not so subtle forms of exclusion occasioned in the name of black community and dominant forms of black anti-racist politics, but also stand as an emblem, a metaphor, in those discourses of the historic and present exclusions occasioned in the name of racial respectability. This essay represents an attempt to account in a somewhat historical vein for that exclusion. Part 1. That was the introduction. It's in 3 parts, or 4 maybe, but from the summit. In the fall of 2005, I attended a national summit called by the National Black Justice Coalition in Washington, D.C. of 150 black, gay, and lesbian leaders. NBJC was formed in 2003 when a handful of leaders from the LGBT African American community banded together to challenge support from African American religious leaders and civil rights leaders for Republican-led efforts to amend the Constitution to prohibit same-sex marriage. The group began raising funds to place ads promoting marriage equality in the African American media. The leadership of the organization included board president Keith Boykin, a former White House aide to President Clinton, and a New York Times bestselling author, lawyer, and activist, board vice president Donna Payne, who's a senior constituency organizer for the Human Rights Campaign, and executive director H. Alexander Robinson. The summit was the first of its kind in scope, bringing black LGBT activists, policymakers, politicians, scholars, and leaders of nonprofits together in D.C. We also had time in the program where the leadership of the mainstream national gay and lesbian organizations, and by mainstream I mean white, HRC, GLAAD, PFLAG, Lambda Legal, etc., came to talk with all of us as well. The conversations were fruitful, but there were 2 things that were most interesting about the meeting for me. And the first one was that the Congressional Black Caucus was holding its annual meeting at the same time that our summit was taking place, and there had been no formal interaction, or was to be no formal interaction, between the 2 groups. Indeed, Alexander Robinson, the executive director of NBJC, points to this as a problem in an interview that he had with the Metro Weekly, a DC-based LGBT news magazine. And he states the following: "We've made efforts in the past to build relationships with the CBC, but it's like any other caucus. It's made up of individual members who have very different political agendas. We have relationships that are good, bad, better. Dealing directly with gay and lesbian issues has been a challenge. Generally, the caucus has been very good on being willing to address HIV and AIDS. They have been supportive when it comes to their voting records, addressing HIV and AIDS, but addressing homophobia outside of the AIDS context has been a challenge. It's true that there are some scheduling conflicts," he said, trying to explain again why we weren't meeting with them. "But it's also true that I've been to the CBC Legislative Weekend for the last 5 years, and there are 6 or so openly gay people who attend. It's not as if the 130 people who've signed up for the summit were going to be over at CBC. They just weren't going to be present, end quote. The next thing that struck me occurred on the second day of the summit during a discussion of Minister Louis Farrakhan's Millions More March. And some of the summit members were advocating and advertising a protest rally that was being staged at 8 o'clock in the morning of the Millions More March, which was held on October 15th, 2005, where black LGBTs would meet to protest the exclusion of gay and lesbian participation in the march. Now, Cleo Managa, who was here earlier, referred to the speaker who had been invited from the Black Men's Exchange. I wish Cleo were still here, but in fact, he was that speaker who had been invited to speak at the march. But this was also after a series of conversations that have been taking place with NBJC for several months leading up to the summit. And it was a kind of last-minute decision to invite the Black Men's Exchange to be the group that would actually represent black gays and lesbians. And there's a larger conversation to be had about NBJC and the Black Men's Exchange, which we could certainly have as well, but I won't use my time to talk about that right now. But that decision itself is also a deeply, it seems to me, politicized one as well. Not good or bad, but certainly politicized. So I'm talking here about NBJC's exclusion, but that is related to the comment that Cleo made earlier. The plan was to join the larger Millions More March en masse in protest of our exclusion. To be even more specific, Minister Louis Farrakhan had taken a meeting via conference call with a delegation from NBJC, which was likely itself an historic event, regarding their participation in the planning body of the event and their request for an openly gay and openly lesbian speaker on the main stage at the event. The minister spoke in terms of inclusion of gay and lesbian brothers and sisters, but did not commit during that meeting to either of their formal requests. At a later meeting in person with Farrakhan and the Reverend Willie Wilson, a virulently homophobic DC-based minister and executive director of the march, NBJC leadership maintains that an agreement for NBJC President Boykin to speak was worked out between the two sides. Indeed, the Washington Post reported that, quote, the meeting ended with hugs from Farrakhan. And what NBJC said was an offer for Boykin to speak during the Unity Tapestry section of the program, end quote. Still on the day of the event, Boykin was denied admission to the dais by Wilson, who denied that Boykin was guaranteed a speaking slot, telling the Post that Boykin straight out lied. There were certain conditions that he had to meet in order to speak, and he did not. Wilson refused to elaborate on exactly what those conditions were. Now, when all of this came up at the summit and the leadership began to discuss plans for a protest rally that would end in attending the march to show our disenfranchisement, I rose to address the summit for the first time and related the following. Now, this is me recreating my address to the summit. Okay. A few years ago, I was at UC San Diego delivering a lecture about the homophobia inherent in much African Americanist critical discourse. That presentation was the germ of what became an article for which I became somewhat well known in certain circles, Can the Queen Speak? Racial Essentialism, Sexuality, and the Problem of Authority. After that lecture was over dinner with a few of my colleagues, one of them asked me a question that would haunt me for some time to come. Why, he asked, do you feel the need to argue about the homophobia of the black community as if you need its inclusion or approval? Why not create your own community or just speak to your specific community of black gays and lesbians? Should you fight so hard to be included in something where you are not wanted? I told my colleagues something that day that I still believe. It is not their community. It never has been theirs alone. They've just been taught to believe that it is. We have the unfortunate task of having now to do the knowledge corrective work of showing them that black history is also black gay and lesbian history. Black literature is also black gay and lesbian literature. But today, I continued addressing my colleagues at the summit, I must admit that as we sit here in this room and talk once again about how we must strategize to shame our heterosexist brothers and sisters into a place at the table of black inclusivity, I am not down for it. I will not be attending the Millions More March. I will not be attending a protest taking issue with our exclusion. I'm not in the mood to beg for a place at the table that I grew up eating at, the table that my money from my labor helped to buy when the old one was worn of use, the table where I learned to play spades and bid whiz, the same table where I mourned with family when loved ones had passed on. I would not be silenced as Locke and Hughes were, or shamed as Rustin and Baldwin were, or kept in the closet as Vandross and Cleveland were. I would not march, I would not show up and give any power or credence to their gesture of exclusion over us. What I would do is what I am called to do. I would stand on the outside and talk about, teach about, write about how fucked up their homophobia is, and what an absolute shame it is that we are still wasting precious time and resources in the face of the enormous economic and social privation and devastation being visited on black people in this nation and throughout the diaspora, arguing still about the lines of inclusion for black identity. We all have roles to play in this struggle. Some have to meet with Farrakhan. I don't have the temperament for that. But great respect for those who do. Some have to organize protests to highlight our exclusion by the black political establishment. Some have to be critics, truth tellers, seers, those that call upon the angels of our better natures, those that help us to dream what we might yet become, sometimes well before we're ready or able to imagine that future. That is the way of the writer, the artist, and just sometimes the scholar. And with that, I once again took my seat at the summit. Many white folk, mostly gay folks, have said to me over a number of conversations how unusual it is that the black community and the gay and lesbian community should be at odds over the issue of same-sex marriage. Now, while the naivete of that question settles on me on each occasion, my thoughts turn to history, and what, other than the most obvious structural similarities, they could possibly be presuming was ever a natural alliance between blacks and gays. Anti-gay conservatives, and perhaps in this one case better students of history, did not presume any such alliance. Indeed, they counted on the very issue of marriage equality to drive a wedge between blacks and gays. But none of that is new. Despite the fact that in the march of black anti-racist discourse one has always been able to hear the distant patter of lighter loafers, and despite the fact that the winds of change for black America have always carried with them the echoes of gay and lesbian brothers and sisters, or despite the fact that the fervor and famed political commitment of the black church has always relied upon the labor of gays and lesbians so long as we served in silence, and we know all too well about the hushing, the quiet as it's kept acceptance of some of our most celebrated black artists, writers, and culture producers. The difference this time is that black LGBTs are coming out, speaking out, and demanding in a variety of ways, and on differing terms, some of which we've heard about today, a place at the black community's proverbial welcome table. The breaking of the tacit bond of silence is what marks this substantively different moment, as a substantively different moment. And I'll say a bit more about that later. Part 2, Bad Days and Ugly Ways. Remarks on Black History Month 2005. When a Chicago African-American minister, the Reverend Gregory Daniels, declared in February of 2004 that if the KKK opposes gay marriage, then I'd ride with them. And that's a quote. I knew that we were facing a new and dangerous era in the civil rights struggle. This was not, to my mind, an isolated incident, but rather a sign of the times. So it was hardly surprising when the Bush administration used marriage to drive a wedge between structurally traditional, though perhaps always historically and culturally a bit uneasy, progressive allies, the LGBT community and African American community. Like many black religious leaders, Daniels believed that his authority and authenticity as a spokesperson for African Americans requires adherence to the homophobia proffered by the religious right. To be strong men and women of the ilk of Daniels and more recently Bernice King, the anti-gay daughter of Martin Luther King Jr., they believe they must carve away at the civil rights of others. When black leaders, religious or otherwise, start to sound like the darker cousins of Jerry Falwell, it gives an entirely new twist to the old adage about politics and strange bedfellows. African American leaders and clerics alike must stop pretending that the black community that they so fervently represent includes only heterosexuals. They need to understand that homophobia, especially in the service of black civil rights, is always wrong. We can't morally sacrifice the rights of one vulnerable minority for another. and we must stop treating black oppression as if it were sacred turf. What do we gain by using the lessons, legacy of black oppression in this way? If my story as a black gay man can be useful to helping another oppressed person to gain her freedom, I would gladly share it. As a black gay man, I recognize that I cannot trust my freedom to be fully achieved through what are current black civil rights politics or current LGBT politics. For now, I work and struggle, as many of us do, on the margins of both, hoping to make each more inclusive, more responsible, and more effective. There is certainly much to be said about the racism found in the gay and lesbian community. There's much to be said about the overwhelming use of white faces to represent that community in mainstream media and the notable absence of people of color from those representations. Again, much of what we've heard about today as well. But whatever our feelings about the whiteness of mainstream representations of the gay and lesbian community, we have to own up to the fact that we black folk also practice exclusion in representations of our community. We exclude black gays and lesbians. The national debate currently being waged over same-sex marriage strikes a deep chord in the American psyche. It brings strong political convictions alongside religious and moral ones. The stakes become deeply personal in such cases, bringing together odd bedfellows indeed. The gay rights movement must become more responsible for the racism that exists in our midst. We see this in the way that an African-American man could not possibly be viewed in queer media as representing the universal gay male experience in the way that white men can and indeed do. A quick perusal through any number of ads and photographs, again, much of which we've seen today, in any of the national tabloids, Out, Genre, The Advocate, Instinct will bear this out. We see this when, for example, the story of, and Dean mentioned this earlier today, of Matthew Shepard becomes monumental and representative in the gay community, while the story of African-American lesbian Zakiya Gunn is barely remembered or reported. Kim Pearson, a professor of law, did a study that demonstrated that in the 7 months following each of their respective murders, there were 659 stories in major newspapers about Shepard's murder, compared to 21 about Gunn's. Just as a footnote. Black folk need to be more responsible for our homophobia. This homophobia is in part what feeds the resistance to the black community to have its struggle compared to that of the gay rights movement. Some black folk believe that such comparison sullies the history of African American struggles, so we forget all about our gay brothers and sisters who populate our lives. Black gays and lesbians are part of the black community, and what might we ask do we gain from excising gays and lesbians from that community? And for whom and toward what purpose would we be doing that work? As long as the government is in the business of recognizing civil marriage, to deny that right to some citizens while conferring it onto others rises, to my mind, to the very height of the great historic civil rights breaches. And I'm no fan of marriage, to be sure, but that's an entirely different matter. But this is the modern three-fifths compromise, our very own version of Jim Crow segregation. Part 3. Are we still talking about black homophobia toward a genealogy? In his recent book, Phonography's Grooves in Sonic Afro-Modernity, my Chicago colleague Alex Wahalia reminds us that although there are many theories of modernity, 3 moments are commonly taken to be the grounds upon which that longue durée is erected. First, the beginning of secularization in the Renaissance. Second, the Enlightenment, as well as the rise of capitalism and the Industrial Revolution in the 18th century and the early 19th century. And third, the proliferation of information technologies such as the phonograph, telegraph, telephone, and cinematograph at the end of the 19th century. All these prostheses of modern origins emphasize the ascent and proliferation of reason, secularization, progress, humanism, individualism, rationalism, and industrialization, and so on, end quote. Now, Wahalia's book concerns primarily the third of these grand narratives of modernity. For my purposes today, I want to borrow the first 2 ideas about modernity to speculate on how the operationalizing of the idea of modernity as a progress, conventionally associated with secularization and the proliferation of reason, takes on some rather unique characteristics in African American cultural politics. When we think back to the time of the New Negro or the Harlem Renaissance, a period in which black men and women, writers, artists, and scholars, only a generation or two out of slavery, first had the space in which to begin imagining, thinking, and theorizing about the possibilities, the character and nature, political function, and so forth of black art, one can only even now glimpse the awesome, overwhelming, and wildly liberating sense of mission that they had to confront. It comes through most clearly in their proclamations and speculations and theorizations about Negro art and the Negro artist. They were convinced that the day of the new Negro had arrived, and his was a story of progress if there ever was one. Ugly, fraught, complicated, backbreaking, but a story of progress nonetheless. A story that, if it was not to be centered in our academic narratives about modernity, would certainly be a ghost in its machinery with which it would someday have to reckon. But what is it that caused the new Negro in his particular version of modernity as progress, and specifically as racial progress, to eschew secularism rather than embrace it, and to cling fervently to an admixture of moral and racial respectability in as his entree to the modern, his calling card to humanity, his salvation from the dark ages of oppression? Evelyn Brooks Higginbotham, in her oft-cited book Righteous Discontent, The Women's Movement in the Black Baptist Church, 1880 to 1920, writes the following illuminating words about the women's movement in the Black Baptist Church, and I quote, "Between 1900 and 1920, the women's movement in the Black Baptist Church contested the racial exclusivist image of America as it was understood and promoted by the dominant white society. For the sake of America's soul, they reasoned, the nation must put an end to lines of color, of blood, of birth. Their religious and political message was drawn from biblical teachings, the philosophy of racial self-help, and Victorian ideology and the democratic principles of the Constitution. Black Baptist women appropriated all these discourses as they infused concepts such as equality, self-respect, professionalism, and American identity with their own intentions and interpretations. In the dialogic sense of multiple and conflicting meanings, these concepts became new, resistant pronouncements against white public opinion. While adherence to respectability enabled black women to counter racist images and structures, their discursive contestation was not directed solely at white Americans. The Black Baptist women condemned what they perceived to be negative practices and attitudes among their own people. The politics of respectability emphasized reform of individual behavior and attitudes, both as a goal in itself and a strategy for reform of the entire structural system of American race relations." End quote. Now, this case, among others, presents strong evidence that black anti-racist strategy at the turn of the century, and one could certainly trace it back even further than that, I'd argue into the late 18th century, viewed adherence to a cultural code of moral and racial respectability as the best means to resist white racism for the Negro to progress as an equal partner in the project of modernity. It is important to note, though it perhaps goes without saying, that blacks developed such reasoning under the perception, be it real or imagined, of the white hegemonic eyes whose gaze was fixed firmly upon them. Indeed, I don't think it overstates the case to say that white racism and its pursuant logics was a key factor in the production of this particular brand of racial and moral respectability. And once we begin to recognize this particular narrative that characterizes blacks' relationship to modernity as progress, which tells a story of our unflagging commitment to respectability, then we come a long way toward appreciating the echoes, the elliptical rhetoric, and the intensity of intra-racial critique that characterizes a good deal of African American literary criticism at the turn of the century. Part 4, and the final part, Aladdin's Lamps. Echoes of sexuality in the discourse of the new Negro. And I begin with a quote from Elaine Locke's 1950 essay, Self-Criticism, the Third Dimension. The Negro intellectual is still largely in psychological bondage, not only to the laws and customs of the local Southern culture, but to the fear of breaking the taboos of Puritanism, Philistinism, and falsely conceived conventions of race respectability. Consciously and subconsciously, these repressions work great artistic harm, especially the fear of being accused of group disloyalty and misrepresentation in portraying the full gamut of Negro type, character, and thinking. We are still in the throes of counter-stereotype. The releasing formula is to realize that in all human things are basically and inevitably human, and that even the special racial complexities and overtones are only interesting variants. Why then the protective silence about the ambivalences of the Negro upper classes, about the dilemmas of intra-group prejudice and rivalry, about the dramatic inner paradoxes of mixed heritage, or the tragic breach between the Negro elite and the Negro masses, or the conflict between integration and vested interest separatism in the present-day life of the Negro? These, among others, are the great themes, but they molder in closed closets like family skeletons, rather than shine brightly as the Aladdin's lamps that they really are." End quote. Now, the Elaine Locke who authored this 1950 essay was from which this epigraph is taken, was more open-eyed about the Negro Renaissance and what it actually was able to accomplish. He strikes a notably different tone from the Locke of 25 years before, who edited and authored the Introduction to the New Negro. That Locke spoke urgently of the New Negroes not so much as a rival as his perceptibility at last in terms such as a changeling or a metamorphosis or the promise and warrant of new leadership. Whereas the Locke of 1950 began his essay by describing the Harlem Renaissance in much less laudatory terms, with such phrases as the so-called Negro Renaissance, a certain lingering immaturity, and the admitted shortcomings of our literary and artistic output in the 1920s, 30s, and 40s. He admits in the essay that all of us probably expected too much of the Negro Renaissance, but its new vitality of independence, pride, and self-respect, its scoff and defiance of prejudice and limitations were so welcome and heartening. Like the adolescence it was, the new Negro era was gawky and pimply, indiscreet and overconfident, vainglorious and irresponsible, but its testy dynamic gave the new Negro new spiritual stature and an added dimension of self-reliance. Now, while Locke's solemnity here is evident, it would be wrong to say that Locke has abandoned the ideas that he espoused in 1925 about the new Negro Renaissance and its possibility. He had, however, come face to face with the formidable foes of American racism, coupled with black racial and moral respectability, and their incredibly deforming properties and potentials as they concern the work of the writer and the artist. Whatever the differences in tone between the two essays, the one striking similarity that I would briefly like to call attention to today lies in the clear references and non-references to sexuality that haunt the racial text, with its commitments to, and at times defiance of, in Locke's case, black moral and racial respectability. As we listen to Locke's sometimes excited stridency, we can hear, if we pay careful attention, the echoes of the silent brother in his quiet critique of the hegemony of dominant anti-racist discourses and strategies. In one of the many diasporic moments in the essay, Locke comments about the diversity, and I'm suggesting the term in all of the complexity that it has for Locke here, of Harlem, and by extension the black community, by saying, and I quote, "It had attracted the African, the West Indian, the Negro American, and brought together the Negro of the North and the Negro of the South, the man from the city and the man from the towns and villages, the peasant, the student, the businessman, the professional man, artist, poet, musician, adventurer, and worker, preacher, and criminal, exploiter, and social outcast. Each group has come with its own special motives and for its own special ends, but their greatest experience has been the finding of one another," end quote. Now, there are many things to say about this passage, but I want to call attention to the list. Locke is rhetorically a man of lists and metaphor. Both are always fruitful places to linger in his work. He gives us cultural diversity, regional diversity, and class diversity. All the occupations that he lists up to preacher are reputable. There is no shame in being a peasant or a worker or the rest of these, for the most part, clear prestige occupations. It is at preacher, however, the symbolic purveyor of morality and religion, that the list takes a decided term to the criminal, exploiter, and social outcast. Black same-gender loving folk in such a list, certainly any who were open about their sexuality, would have belonged to the last listed category of social outcasts, something Locke well understood as a gay man himself. But here Locke's tone has a ring of the can't we all just get along motif to it. This changes by the time we get to his lists in the 1950 essay. His tone is far more critical. In that essay, he's not celebrating diversity and the solace of the finding of one another. Rather, he is concerned deeply with the ways in which consciously and subconsciously these repressions associated with racial respectability work great artistic harm. He decries the protective silence about the long list of items that I referred to earlier in the epigraph to this section of the essay. These, he reminds us, among others, are the great themes, but they molder in closed closets like family skeletons, rather than shine brightly as the Aladdin's lamps that they really are. The reference to closed closets, though not a term likely to be used in the way it is in our post-coming-out era, may be read as prescient by Locke. In this context, the closed closet certainly retains the connotation of secrecy, especially when compared in a simile with family skeletons, which might certainly be read as encompassing the silenced sexuality of so many of the writers of the Harlem Renaissance, including Locke himself. Indeed, in the sentence that I just quoted, it is the elliptical nature of the phrase that follows his long list that I find most telling. The phrase that comes just before the reference to closed closets. Locke says, these, among others, are the great themes. That little dependent clause that names the thing or things that he could not name is the space in which Locke enacts the very tyranny that he's wrestling against in the essay, and which he was hopeful in the earlier essay that the New Negro Renaissance might indeed help to defeat. The closing paragraph of the essay is so remarkable in demonstrating further the point here that I quoted in its entirety. And I quote, "To break such taboos is the crucial artistic question of the moment. The wrath of Negro Rotarians, preachers, college presidents, and journalists, a respectable list if there ever was one, notwithstanding. It is this inner tyranny that must be conquered. I am far from suggesting," Locke says, "that even a considerable part of this revelation will be morally risque or socially explosive. Some of it will be, of course. But I do sense a strange and wildly diffused feeling that many of these situations are Masonic secrets, things to be talked about but not written or officially disclosed. Maybe now that a few Negro authors have demonstrated the possibility of financial independence and success as writers, some of our younger talents can shake free of the white-collar servitudes of job dependency on the one hand and the conventional race loyalty on the other. If so, we may confidently anticipate an era of fuller and more objective presentation by Negro authors of their versions of contemporary living in general and of Negro life and experience." End quote. Now, with very few emendations, I could and probably have indeed used very similar rhetoric to describe the homophobia and heterosexism that animates much of the race politics of African Americanist critical discourse today. The same phenomenon of race loyalty is one that complicates the issue of marriage equality for many African Americans. I don't defend the position, even though marriage is not an institution I'm particularly enamored with, but I do think that it is important to understand in somewhat historical and political terms what we're up against. Locke could not call it by its name. Today we can, and I suppose that represents a new kind of racial progress. I'm going to skip the part on Hughes and just go ahead to the conclusion. I've been trying to argue that African Americans' view of modernity as progress differs as a result of the regime of white racism in the U.S. That difference manifests itself in the form of an adherence to a code of racial and moral respectability as a primary anti-racist strategy. And anti-racism has, for African Americans, been most clearly identified with the narrative of progress and modernity. But there are ramifications to this discursive history. One of those ramifications is the idea of the black community as bounded, policeable, and finite. Much of the adopting of the politics of racial respectability was done to demonstrate to whites how like them we could be as a way of proving our humanity. Hence, this paper's subtitular reference to the grateful Negro, a figure who represents the hegemony of assimilationist politics and logic in black anti-racist struggle. The earliest literary reference to the grateful Negro that I'm aware of is that of Maria Edgeworth in 1802, a short story by the same title. In that tale, Caesar, the so-called grateful Negro, out of loyalty to his white master, betrays his friend Hector by exposing Hector's plan for a slave revolt. This seems an appropriate and productive genesis to an idea with such a long and vexed history. At one time, the grateful Negro was standing outside a literary movement that he or she helped to create, begging permission to be him or herself. Today's grateful Negro is standing at the welcome table of symbolic black inclusion in the form of the Millions More March, once again asking permission to belong and to participate. And the most frightening grateful Negro of all is the one who really believes in the lessons learned by this particular brand of racial progress, represented by respectability. He or she is grateful to be washed, scrubbed, and cleaned for the pleasure of his oppressor, in hopes that that same oppressor will let him share in some fantasy of true democracy. In American racial logic, what the U.S. has long thought it wanted is a grateful Negro, willing to see his liberation in terms established by his oppressor, imagining his progress, his move into modernity as concomitant with the moral policing and whitewashing of his racial identity. The truth that we are finally beginning to see, however, slowly and painfully, is that the last thing that this country needs for the evolution of democracy is another instantiation of a grateful Negro. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. McBride. We've asked Professor Russell Robinson to serve as a respondent to the keynote address, and as most of you know, Professor Robinson is an acting professor of law here at UCLA, and that he graduated with honors from Harvard Law School in 1998 after receiving his BA summa cum laude from Hampton University. Many of you also know that Professor Robinson clerked for Judge Dorothy Nelson of the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals and for Justice Stephen Breyer of the U.S. Supreme Court. But we here really know him and love him for holding a unique and courageous space in this building, which is that of an openly gay man of color who centers his interests in race and sexuality into his personal, professional, and scholarly commitments. I give you Professor Robinson.
I have no technical skills. I just do law. So we're going to get some help. Yeah, you can push play. Okay, great. Excellent. Thank you. First of all, let me thank you all for being here at this late hour. When we first planned this symposium, so as you may know, this is our second annual CRS symposium, and we planned on having a scaled-down event. We thought/feared that because it was focusing on queer people, it might be a smaller crowd. And I'm thrilled to see that we have numbers that I think approach or exceed the numbers that we had last year. So this is really quite wonderful. Thank you. Let me thank Dwight also for agreeing to be our keynote speaker and for providing incisive analysis that touches on many of the themes from today's presentations. There's some interesting synergy in terms of a lot of the pieces that people were providing earlier in your talk. I can't, so time is limited, it is late, so sadly I can't engage all of the wonderful points that he made, nor can I recite all of the virtues of his talk. But I do want to point out that his work, and especially his book, Why I Hate Abercrombie and Fitch, was the initial spark that motivated this symposium. I mean, I think the title of the book alone is genius. I love saying it a lot. And maybe that just sort of speaks to my experience in terms of feeling in some way oppressed by the imagery of white men as the sort of aesthetic ideal, which I think a lot of us struggle with on a daily basis. But I want to focus on Dwight's compelling question, whether black queer people, and by analogy other queer people of color, will continue to play the role of grateful Negro, perpetually standing at the margins of an equality movement organized around race, asking permission to participate and to belong. I want to complement his analysis by asking a related question. And I think it's important that we ask both. Will queer people of color continue to play the role of grateful Negro vis-a-vis the dominant white LGBT community? Must we continually struggle to take part in the fantasy represented by the Abercrombie advertisements? The pale, glistening, rock-hard, and eternally youthful bodies that tell us what we should all want to be and want to be with. In thinking about this question, it came to mind my experience at a popular West Hollywood lounge about a year ago. While celebrating a friend's birthday at the Abbey, which people apparently know, I was with a small group of other gay men of color. We watched a male go-go dancer gyrate in front of us, and this man could have easily walked out of an Abercrombie ad. Okay, so he was white, he was lily white. And so I turned to another member of the party that I did not know well, but who seemed to be transfixed by the dancer. And this man was Asian American, and I said, "Is that your type?" And before he could even answer, a white male stranger who was standing behind us interjected and said, "Honey, that's everyone's type." That was stunning to me, that he couldn't even imagine that as an African American, as an Asian American, we might have other preferences. It was assumed that every man would want the Abercrombie clone. And the stranger's assumption, I think, reflects the monopoly on LGBT imagery held by privileged white gay men, whether in gay rights litigation, politics, movies, magazines, or advertisements. Images of the idealized gay body tend to be white and, importantly, male. Devin Carbato has written eloquently of the decisions by gay rights groups to present a but-for gay male plaintiff, a man who, but for his sexual orientation, was just like everybody else. That is, just like every other white heterosexual person. So Perry Watkins, and the slide here shows him, was a black Army sergeant who was the first openly gay serviceman to challenge successfully the military's discriminatory policies against gays and lesbians. Yet gay rights groups kept him in the closet in their public campaign to change Don't Ask, Don't Tell, because he didn't fit the image they wanted to portray. In the same vein, Urvashi Vayed tells of her struggle to be viewed as a legitimate leader of an LGBT advocacy organization. One white donor complained that Vayed, a South Asian woman, was, quote, practically a nigger. Another white man advised her that she would have more success with the white male donors if she stayed in the background and hired a quote, nice white man with a cute ass to front for her. In terms of media, UCLA's Brad Sears has written that the control of adult films by a small group of white men enabled them to produce a monolithic beauty standard, which is just a more explicit version of the Abercrombie icon. Here's an example of that. You see the blonde hair, the rock-hard abs, the football gear, again, the sort of athletic male, white male ideal. Now, some people would dismiss this as an example of an adult film, right? So some people would say, why are we talking about that in the law school? This is kind of strange. I haven't seen an image like this in any of my law school classes. But I think it's important to talk about this realm of fantasy because I think that, in particular, a lot of men who are just sort of learning their gay identities, right? And before maybe they've even begun having sex with another man, watch adult films, right? And they're learning about sex roles, they're learning about racial stereotypes, and what roles they're supposed to play. And so I think it's important to think about these domains and how they connect to legal domains. And so also, to the extent that men of color are included in media imagery, they typically are paired with a white man and framed in a subordinate or fetishizing light. And Cleo Monago talked about that earlier. As I've written elsewhere, men of color, not just in film, but in daily life, face pressure to play out certain stereotypical racial roles, such as the aggressive black buck or the effeminate Asian boy. Consider this image from one interracial adult film, and there's a huge genre. Dwight, again, has written about this in a lovely chapter from his book. Hotel 2000, right? So you see the bucks, and then their white boy who is I don't know what to say about that image. Okay, let's just go on. And I should say, I think that these stereotypes play out in actual romantic relationships. Dwight also has written about personal ads, which Devin talked about in the beginning of the symposium. And I'm currently working on an empirical study that looks at a popular gay website to try to understand the role that race plays in terms of the way that people describe themselves and the partners that they're looking for, and also the demand that particular men face or enjoy based on their race and the sex role that they perform. I want to point out that this imagery is connected to broader images beyond adult films and beyond white-controlled media. So 50 Cent, right? Doesn't look too different from the black bucks that were in the prior image. I think that we need to think more critically about how we contribute to this image of the hypermasculine black male. And when I say we, I mean specifically black people, right? This is something that cuts across in terms of not just a queer issue, it's also certainly an issue for heterosexual people. And we buy this, we consume this. People across racial lines consume not just 50 Cent, but as Phil Goff suggested, this sort of image of the black man and the aggression and the sexuality that he's offering us. I also think we need to talk about mainstream film. So Brokeback Mountain. This, of course, was hailed as a groundbreaking film for gay men. Yet the romantic and sympathetic framing of the film's lovers contrasts here this sort of gentle pose with the image of the black man in the adult film. This romantic and sympathetic framing is not generally applicable to men of color who engage in indistinguishable practices. When black men secretly have sex with men and continue to carry on relationships with women, the media calls them down low. Black men on the so-called down low are framed as sexual terrorists, secretly infecting black women with HIV, not as victims of the closet. The only moment in Brokeback where sexual deviance rears its ugly head is when Jack, who is missing his lover Ennis, takes a dark sojourn to Mexico, where he has sex with a Mexican prostitute. Again, people of color are on the margins and represent deviance rather than humanity. To the extent that LGBT people are beginning to be framed as victims, and I think Dean Spade talked about this, deserving social justice, people of color are still waiting in line for their turn. At best, like the black woman in the Abercrombie and Fitch ad, we are stuck in the crease. In light of this persistent exclusion, why must we wait in line? Or, as one woman said during the Q&A, why do we want in? Why not use our unique experiences at the bottom to question the dominant gay culture and forms of identification? In a new article, I am tentatively critiquing 3 central components of gay male identity, and I stress male because I think that there is a significant difference here between male and female queer identities. I critique the notion that 1, gay men are inherently less masculine than straight men. They are seen as fallen men, a hybrid of male and female in their gender performance. Marianne Case spoke about the fear that men have of becoming women. Right? According to some men in the military, there's nothing worse. Moreover, the conceptualization of black men as ultra-masculine, I think it sets them up for a greater fall than other men. This morning, Dwight spoke, and I was moved about his struggle to overcome stereotypes in being appointed as dean. Deans are expected to be tough-minded, powerful, and decisive. And Dwight's sexual identity was unfairly deployed to suggest that he lacked these traits. So again, this image of fallen man is pervasive and quite harmful, and in an employment context. The second component I am critiquing is of gay affluence. Despite powerful empirical work that has not received its due, including studies done by the Williams Institute at UCLA, people continue to link sexual orientation with social sophistication and consumerism. The idea of LGBT poverty is an oxymoron. Also, consumerism is plays a critical role in forming the very concept of gay identity. David Eng has talked about this earlier. Buying the Abercrombie outfit, buffing one's body at the overpriced gym, and I'm a member of an overpriced gym, I must admit. and living in a queer enclave, right, like West Hollywood. These are the means of identifying one as gay. We don't really know what people are doing in their bedrooms for the most part, right? We don't have a window into that. But it's these performances that identify one as gay. But of course, many LGBT people, including many of color, lack the resources to render these performances. It bears repeating what Cheryl Harris said earlier. They're not selling clothes, they're selling a world. And the third component that I want to critique is this expectation of hypersexuality. This is the expectation that gay men have more sex than straight men and have more sexual partners. We are said to be inherently more sexual in our very nature. Never mind studies suggesting that 25% of gay men are presently celibate, a much larger number than straight men. All three themes are apparent in the following joke, which circulated on the internet not long after the release of Brokeback Mountain. Has anybody seen this Brokeback shopping list? Okay, so as you probably know, this Oscar-nominated film depicts two male ranch hands in rural Wyoming gradually falling into a romance while herding sheep one summer. The joke is that as Jack and Ennis transition from co-workers to lovers, their culinary preferences begin to reflect their gay identities. Okay, so they go from, now you get the joke, right? So in the beginning, they make do with the basics. Beans, bacon, coffee, whiskey. Very manly, right? As their sexual relationship unfolds, their appetites simultaneously expand while becoming more refined. Whiskey is replaced with Chardonnay. Ordinary beans are jettisoned in favor of fresh fava beans. Regular coffee will no longer do. They need espresso. Their growing interest in refined food suggests that their sexual conduct progressively feminizes them, because real men, their supposed status before falling into gay sex, prefer whiskey to Chardonnay, for example. If this point were not already clear, the joke hammers it home by adding in the final list 6 yards of white silk organdy, 6 yards of pale ivory taffeta. I'm not quite sure what they're going to do with that out on the farm. Moreover, the growing sophistication and feminization of Jack and Ennis corresponds with an increasingly ravenous sexual appetite. Initially, they make do with 2 tubes of KY jelly, but in the end, they require a large tin of Crisco. Apparently, they have become so consumed by swinging from the chandeliers that they no longer have time to herd sheep. So, the interesting thing, I think, about this joke and about the 3 components of gay identity is that pro-gay conceptions of gay identity bear a discomforting resemblance to anti-gay conceptions. Now, maybe I've become a humorless academic and I should be able to laugh at this joke, but it was sent to me by a pro-gay straight female friend who thought it was funny, and I was offended. Maybe I should just get a sense of humor. But anyway, I'm writing about it. So, although gay men attempt to put their own liberatory normative spins on these concepts, the core descriptive claims are quite similar to those of anti-gay forces. In my article, I attempt to show that these conceptions further marginalize men of color and other men who cannot identify with these expectations of effeminacy, affluence, and hypersexuality. If these conceptions tell us what it means to be gay, we should not be surprised that a black man in, say, Inglewood, California, rather than West Hollywood, who is masculine and unrecognizable as gay, who wears baggy pants and a hoodie, and who regularly attends church and shows sexual restraint, does not identify as gay. Yet this man is perceived as a racial deviant for failing to embrace the dominant gay identity. By looking to the bottom, to borrow from Mari Matsuda, we can start to think about dismantling and diversifying the dominant gay culture. Thank you.
Before we go, I just want to say one more thing, and that is because Russell gave us a lot to think about. One, I wanted to make sure that Kim wasn't in the room when we first started, so I want to say it now. Kim, I'd be remiss if I go back to Chicago without relating a message from my colleagues in the Department of African American Studies that you really need to come and do the Grace Holt lecture next year. They really, really want that to happen. So I told them I would relate the message to Kim, and so message related. We will make sure you have a fabulous time. I will assure that. But I wanted to thank Russell for his comments too. And there are several things that he touched on that I'd love to say more about, but I'll leave that for a conversation over wine and martinis. Whiskey. I heard though that this what's up with this non-alcoholic reception? I want to holler at somebody about that, later. But I did want to say that the work that's happened here today and that people are engaged in. I mean, what's really exciting about this, when I started graduate school, the beginnings of this were still happening. And to see graduate students and young faculty members writing books and publishing articles about issues that are so germane and so incredibly important to our lives and telling our stories finally is amazing and incredible to me. I think about until the Black Pride survey of a few years ago, it was really the first time that social scientists had actually taken the time to begin creating data sets about black gays and lesbians. And so to hear this young woman today in one of the earlier sessions talking about the South Asian needs assessment that they had done, which I want thoroughly to get a copy of. I don't know if she's still here. But that, to me, again, a very exciting work. Or to hear, Mignon's work, which I think will fundamentally change the way in which we have to talk about black families, which is one of the cornerstone courses in the way in which people teach African American studies. So there's just a lot of impact, broad impact that this work has. And I know that sometimes when we're in the trenches and we're doing our little piece of it, it can feel like, you're whittling away at something that doesn't really matter to the rest of the world. But it has a huge impact. And I hope, if nothing else, conferences like this remind us of the breadth of the work and of the importance of the work and of the kind of impact that it can have. So I'm glad to have been here today and so glad to have heard some of the extraordinary work that's going on here. So thank you.
And on that note, we want to also thank all of you for being with us all day long and into the evening. I want to plead guilty for being the person who set up the reception without alcohol. I will suffer the consequences of that out in the South Lobby, where we expect all of you will join us for the conference reception and also for a brief program to recognize our alumni who made this event possible in part with their donations. We really appreciate that. I want to also encourage those of you who still have your evaluations to fill them out and to turn them in. And also to encourage you to start thinking, it's not too early to start thinking about joining us next year for what we hope to be equally stimulating third annual symposium for our program. Thank you.